The Japanese could not believe it. American pilots, outnumbered, outgunned, and facing the legendary Mitsubishi Zero were shooting their prized fighters out of the sky. It was unthinkable. The Zero had been hailed as invincible, its agility unmatched, its kill ratio terrifying. Yet here they were, falling in flames against men who were supposed to be inferior. How could this be happening? It is 1942. The Pacific Ocean is a graveyard of steel, and every clash between aircraft is a gamble with fate. For months, Japanese pilots had flown with absolute confidence, certain that their Zero was untouchable. They had destroyed Allied squadrons from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines with devastating ease. But on one shocking day, their arrogance began to crack. American pilots, flying machines, mocked as clumsy and slow, suddenly found a way to fight back. In just minutes of furious combat, the myth of Japanese superiority was shattered. What secret had the Americans uncovered? What maneuver allowed them to strike at the very heart of Japan's air power? And how did terrified young men in cockpits, some barely trained, summon the courage to defy a foe everyone said could not be beaten? The answer begins here. The truth was this: the Japanese Zero was fast, light, and fearsome. But it was not invincible. The Americans had begun to whisper this truth to one another in the quiet spaces between sorties, as though daring not to speak too loudly, lest the myth hear them and strike them down. And now, in the late spring of 1942, over the burning waters of the Coral Sea and then the fateful skies of Midway, that whisper was turning into proof. You are there. In the cockpit, hands trembling on the throttle. The roar of the engine drowns out every thought except survival. Ahead of you, sunlight glints off the pale green fuselage of a Zero. The Japanese pilot knows. His machine can twist and climb with a grace your aircraft cannot match. He begins his dance, pulling up into a tight spiral, daring you to follow. And for a heartbeat, you remember the stories, the hopeless dives of Allied pilots in Burma, the wreckage scattered across Wake Island, the warnings, never, ever dogfight a Zero. But then you remember the new words spoken in hurried briefings by weary instructors. Words that felt like a lifeline. Don't turn with them. Don't play their game. Use speed. Use the dive. Boom and zoom. It was the beginning of a revelation. American pilots, many of them rookies who had scarcely touched combat before, were discovering that the Zero's greatest strength, its light frame, built for agility, was also its greatest weakness. Strip away its maneuverability, and it had no armor to save its pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks to protect it from fire. Once you hit it, it burned. And the moment you refused to fight on its terms, the moment you forced the battle into vertical dives and slashing attacks, the balance began to shift. But this realization did not come without blood. Many young men paid the price for learning too late. At Coral Sea, 2 squadrons of Wildcats fought valiantly against Zero escorts, losing heavily until a single flight leader decided to test the new tactic. He refused the instinct to turn inside the enemy's loop. Instead, he yanked his nose down, plunged into a steep dive, and clawed back upward in a wide arc. The Zero followed, but too sharply. Its fragile wings shuddered under the stress. A burst of American fire caught it mid-roll, and for the first time, the legendary fighter spiraled down in defeat. The surviving pilots saw it and felt something stir inside them. Perhaps the Zero could be killed after all. This revelation rippled outward. Manuals were written overnight, scribbled in margins, passed from one cockpit to the next. The myth of Japanese invincibility was cracking, but slowly, dangerously, like ice that might still swallow you whole. The Pacific was vast, and in every new encounter, the Japanese pressed their advantage with skill and ruthlessness. Pilots like Saburo Sakai, legends of the Imperial Navy, continued to score kills with an ease that left Americans shaken. Yet even Sakai, who had once mocked American flyers as untrained amateurs, began to notice something unsettling. The amateurs were learning. You imagine his cockpit in those moments. He banks hard, a Wildcat flashing in his gun sight, confident he will destroy it in seconds. He pulls into his loop, but the American does not follow. Instead, the Wildcat dives away at a terrifying angle, then reappears in a blistering head-on pass. Tracers tear through the air. The Zero dodges, but for the first time, Sakai feels a flicker of unease. His advantage is shrinking. The Americans are adapting, and then came midway. For Japanese carriers steamed eastward, the tip of the spear that had once driven into Pearl Harbor itself. Their decks bristled with Zero fighters prepared to sweep the skies clean. Yet on that June morning, their pilots faced an unexpected nightmare. American dive bombers protected by fighters using the new hit-and-run tactics slipped through. Within minutes, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning, towering infernos that turned Japanese victory into sudden ruin. It was here, in the chaos above the fleet, that the Zero's limitations were laid bare for all to see. American fighters, once shredded in desperate turning battles, now attacked with cold precision. They dove, fired, and pulled away, never lingering in the deadly dance the Japanese craved. Zeros fell not in handfuls, but in scores. One Japanese ace, stunned, later admitted that he had seen comrades vanish in seconds, their planes igniting like paper lanterns in the sky. The arrogance that had carried the Imperial Navy across the Pacific was cracking under the weight of flames, and yet the cost for the Americans was still heavy. Pilots were dying by the dozens, some never even firing a shot before a Zero found their tail. Every mission was a gamble, every return to the carrier a miracle. Imagine the faces of these men as they walked the flight deck at night, haunted by the empty bunks around them. Some clenched photographs of wives and sweethearts. Others scribbled letters they knew might never be mailed. They were not fighting machines. They were terrified young men, and yet they flew again and again. Because to give in was to surrender the ocean itself by the summer of 1942. A new name began to echo through American squadrons, the Thach Weave. John Jimmy Thach, a calm, sharp-eyed Navy pilot, had devised it months before, sketching lines on paper in his living room. Two fighters flying together, weaving back and forth, covering each other's blind spots. Alone, an American fighter was easy prey. Together, they could trap a Zero between them, forcing it into the crossfire. It sounded risky, even desperate, but in combat, it worked. Zeros that once started in with impunity now found themselves hunted. Word of the Thach Weave spread like fire. In the Solomon Islands, over Guadalcanal, pairs of Wildcats flew with a new confidence. Pilots once afraid to face the dreaded Zero now baited it deliberately, knowing their wingmen lurked with guns ready. Japanese reports began to record something unthinkable. Their Zeros were not just being challenged, they were being outmaneuvered. The shock reverberated through Japanese command. How could crude American machines, built heavier and slower, turn the tide against the pride of the rising sun? Some officers refused to believe it, blaming poor training or bad luck. Others began to whisper that the Zero, designed in an era of lightning offense, was already outdated against an enemy who refused to fight by the old rules. But the truth was simpler and harsher. The Americans had learned to survive. They had stripped away fear, one battle at a time, and replaced it with cold calculation. And once survival was possible, victory was inevitable. Still, the Japanese did not yield. Their pilots fought with unrelenting ferocity, willing to sacrifice everything for the empire. In the early months of 1943, over the deep jungles of New Guinea, a group of young American pilots found themselves cornered by a squadron of Zeros, outnumbered 3-1. They had little chance. But their leader barked a command: "Weave," and the sky erupted into a deadly dance. For minutes that felt like hours, the Americans twisted and turned, covering each other in perfect rhythm. Zeros dove, fired, and missed. Then, one after another, they were caught in the trap. When the smoke cleared, the Americans, against all odds, flew home. And the Japanese who survived carried back a bitter truth. The enemy had broken the spell. The legend of the Zero was fading. But in its place, something more dangerous was rising. American factories, untouched by war on home soil, were roaring to life. New machines, faster, stronger, more heavily armed, were already rolling off the assembly lines. And the young pilots who had survived those first desperate battles would soon climb into them, bringing with them the hard lessons learned in blood. But before that moment arrived, before the Corsairs and Hellcats and Lightnings swept the skies, one more test awaited. In the steaming jungles and shattered airfields of Guadalcanal, the Americans would fight not just for survival, but for the very first taste of dominance. The Japanese, wounded but unbroken, prepared to unleash their fury. And the men who had once whispered doubts about the Zero would soon face a new question. Darker and more terrifying than any before. What happens when an enemy that cannot believe it can lose? Begins to fight as though it has nothing left to lose. The jungle was alive with sound. At night, crickets screamed, frogs croaked, and somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered like approaching storms. Guadalcanal was no paradise. It was a crucible of mud, disease, and death. For the men who fought there, every sunrise was a coin toss, another chance at survival, or another step toward oblivion. And above this steaming green hell, the struggle for the skies became a nightmare written in fire. You feel it before you see it, the vibration of engines, the pulse of propellers tearing through humid air. The Japanese are coming again. Their Zeros descend in tight formation, sunlight flashing across their wings. Their pilots filled with the same arrogance that had once carried them from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. They believe the Zero is still untouchable. But here, over Henderson Field, they are about to learn how far the war has shifted. The Americans at Guadalcanal were exhausted. Half-starved, their airstrips barely more than dirt scars hacked out of jungle. Yet they held something priceless, hard lessons. Every dogfight, every ambush, every desperate weaving maneuver had carved those lessons into bone. And the men flying the stubby Wildcats and patched-up Airacobras carried that knowledge with them, ready to use it in the desperate ballet of combat. It began with a scream in the radio. Bandits? 11 o'clock high. Black dots grew into shapes, and then into the unmistakable silhouettes of Zeros. The first instinct was still terror. Memories of comrades ripped apart by their guns. Of the myth that once made every American pilot feel like prey. But the terror was followed, almost instantly, by discipline. No turning fights. No chasing their spirals. Dive, fire, climb, regroup. The Thach Weave. You watch it unfold in the sky. Two Wildcats cross paths, weaving back and forth, presenting themselves as bait. A Zero lunges, eager, certain of its kill. But it has walked into a trap. The wingman slides into position, guns chattering, and the Zero erupts into flame. The survivors in the Japanese formation hesitate for the first time, their confidence rattled. For months, they had expected easy victory. Now, their victims are fighting back with precision. Still, the Americans were far from invincible. Every victory came at a cost. For every Zero that fell, an American pilot might not return. The field crews at Henderson counted the empty planes each evening. The bullet-riddled fuselages dragged back by rescue teams, and wondered if tomorrow they would have enough left to defend the strip. The Zeros came in waves, relentless, their pilots willing to die for the Empire. The airfield itself became a symbol. If the Americans lost it, the Pacific would tilt back toward Japan. If they held it, the myth of invincibility would be shattered forever. There was one pilot, a farm boy from the Midwest who had joined the Navy with barely enough hours in the cockpit to feel comfortable in the air. On his first missions, he froze at the sight of the Zero, but by Guadalcanal. He had survived enough close calls to know one truth: hesitation was death. In a battle over the slot, with tracers streaming past his canopy, he pressed into a dive so steep his instruments rattled. A Zero tried to follow, its pilot confident, but the fragile frame buckled in the pressure. The farm boy pulled out of his dive, swung around, and fired. The Zero disintegrated. Later, he would admit that his hands were still shaking when he landed. But in that moment, he realized the myth had died inside him too. And that was the twist the Japanese never anticipated. Fear could vanish. Once stripped of its terror, the Zero was just another machine, dangerous, yes, but vulnerable. American pilots began to talk of them differently. No longer gods of the sky, but predators who could be beaten with discipline, teamwork, and the right tactics. But victory at Guadalcanal was not inevitable. In October 1942, as American forces clung desperately to their strip of land, the Japanese launched a ferocious counterattack. Hundreds of aircraft poured south, carriers steaming to hurl wave after wave of Zeros against the island. Henderson Field became a target for annihilation. The sky darkened with engines, and for hours the air was alive with chaos. It was in this maelstrom that the turning point came. A squadron of American fighters, outnumbered nearly 2-to-1, executed the Thach Weave under crushing pressure. For minutes, it seemed the Zeros would overwhelm them. But as the dogfight stretched on, the Americans began to notice something new. The Japanese pilots were growing reckless, desperate. They broke formation, chased kills, dove too sharply. And for every mistake, the Americans punished them with fire. When the battle ended, the ground crews counted the wreckage. Dozens of Zeros lay shattered across the island or smoldering in the sea. The Americans had lost men to always too many, but the numbers told a story. The Zero was bleeding, its myth evaporating, its pilots shaken. The news rippled back to Tokyo. Reports that once spoke of easy victories now spoke of heavy losses. Commanders whispered in shock. The Americans had found a way to break the Zero's grip. And worse, they were building new machines, Corsairs and Hellcats, that promised to outclimb, outgun, and outrun even the finest of Japanese designs. Yet, even as their empire reeled, the Japanese refused to surrender the skies. They pressed on with grim determination, their pilots flying into combat with the knowledge that death was more likely than survival. They clung to the hope that their ferocity might still break the enemy's will. But the Americans' will was no longer breakable. Every victory, every survival, every pilot who returned home alive proved it. The tide was shifting. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese dominance, was becoming the symbol of its decline. And yet, one question remained unresolved, hanging over the jungles like smoke. If the Zero could be beaten, if its myth could be destroyed, what would Japan do next? Would they adapt with new weapons, new tactics? Or would they turn to something darker, something more desperate to hold on to their empire? That answer would come soon, not in the skies over Guadalcanal, but in the bloody waters of the Solomon Islands, where both sides would gamble everything in battles that would decide the fate of the Pacific. And in those battles, the Americans would discover a truth even more chilling than the myth of the Zero. For an enemy that no longer believes in its own invincibility can still fight with the fury of one who knows he has nothing left to lose. And on those nights, as the jungle echoed with gunfire and the horizon glowed with burning wreckage, the Americans began to wonder, had they truly broken the Japanese spirit? Or had they awakened something far more dangerous? The sea at night was a mirror of fire. Searchlights swept across black waves, shells arced in glowing trails. And every few minutes, the darkness split apart as another ship detonated in fury. The Solomon Islands were no longer a battlefield of men alone. They had become an inferno where land, air, and sea collided in a single struggle for survival. And in this crucible, the Japanese Zero, once worshipped as untouchable, began its final descent from legend to prey. The story unfolded in long, punishing battles. Guadalcanal had been the first crack, but the Solomons were the hammer that widened it into a shatter. Both sides hurled everything they had into the campaign: cruisers, destroyers, carriers, divisions of exhausted soldiers, and, above all, their pilots. The Zeros came as they always had, sleek, agile, merciless, but now the Americans were ready. Henderson Field had taught them to fight without fear. And new planes were arriving, forged in American factories that never slept. The skies above the Solomons were no longer tilted in Japan's favor. You hear the sound before you see them, a rising growl of engines, heavy, relentless. The Americans are bringing in F-4F Wildcats, P-38 Lightnings. Even the deadly new F-4U Corsair with its bent wings and roaring power. Against the fragile Zero, these machines were monsters. Yet the Japanese pilots still fought with fanatical courage, hurling themselves into impossible odds. They dove headlong into formations of bombers, tore through escorts, and sometimes vanished in blossoms of fire. Their courage was undeniable. Their losses were unsustainable. There is one moment that captures it all. A squadron of Zeros intercepts American B-17s lumbering toward a Japanese convoy. At first, the scene looks like countless others. Zeros swarming, tracers streaking, bombers trailing smoke. But then the escorts arrive. P-38s dive in from high above, twin booms glinting in the sun, their guns hammering. Two Zeros ignite in seconds. Another tries to climb, but the Lightning outpaces it with brutal ease, tearing it apart my dark. The Japanese commander shouts into his radio, urging his men to press on. They obey, throwing themselves into hopeless angles, but the tide is clear. When the battle ends, the convoy below is burning. The bombers return with only a handful lost, and the ocean carries the wreckage of Zeros that will never rise again. This was the turning point that the Japanese command could not ignore. The Zero, their miracle weapon of 1941, was losing its edge. It had been built for offense, designed to dominate in the first strike of the war. But wars do not freeze in time. The Americans had adapted, building fighters with thicker armor, heavier guns, and engines that clawed through the air at speeds the Zero could never hope to match. The Americans had once been students, struggling to survive. Now they were the hunters. Yet in Tokyo, the truth was unbearable. Commanders could not accept that the Empire's prized fighter was obsolete. They demanded their pilots do the impossible, ordering them into battles they could not win. And so the skies filled with tragedy. Young Japanese men, some barely out of training, were hurled into dogfights against veterans who had lived through Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. The result was slaughter. You imagine being in one of those cockpits? The Zero shudders under strain. Its controls light but fragile. You see the Corsair streak past, faster than anything you've ever known. Guns blazing. You turn, desperate, but your plane cannot climb as sharply, cannot dive as deep. Bullets rip through your frame. The canopy fills with smoke. For the briefest moment, you understand what your enemy once felt, that sick certainty of being prey. And then the sea rises to claim you. But the Japanese did not stop fighting. If anything, their losses drove them to greater desperation. At night, their destroyers slipped through the slot, resupplying their starving troops on the islands. By day, their pilots threw themselves into furious battles to cover these runs. Sometimes they succeeded, crippling American ships and delaying advances. Other times, they were torn from the skies in waves, their sacrifice buying only hours. And as 1943 turned to 1944, a chilling realization crept across the American ranks. The Japanese might never surrender. They might fight until the last Zero was destroyed, until the last pilot had fallen into the ocean. The climax of the Solomon battles came at Rabaul, the great Japanese stronghold, a fortress bristling with aircraft. When American carriers struck in November 1943, hundreds of Zeros rose to meet them. It was the largest aerial clash the Pacific had yet seen. For a moment, it seemed the old terror had returned to the sky, black with Japanese fighters, swarming with lethal intent. But the Americans came prepared. Hellcats screamed into the melee, their armor shrugging off bullets, their guns cutting wide arcs through the swarms. Dive bombers slipped through, cratering the airfields below. By the end, Rabaul's skies were no longer a shield. They were a graveyard, and yet, out of this devastation came a twist the Americans had not foreseen. The Japanese, watching their pilots fall in droves, began to change. They shifted from confidence to desperation, from tactics to sacrifice. If the Zero could not dominate with maneuver and agility, perhaps it could still be used in another way. The whispers began of missions where survival was no longer expected, where the plane itself became the weapon. For now, these were only murmurs, dismissed as rumor. But the seeds had been planted, seeds that would grow into something darker than anything seen before. Back in the Solomons, the men who survived each sortie began to sense this change. They spoke of Zeros that refused to break off, that rammed into bombers instead of retreating. They told stories of Japanese pilots who fought not to win, but simply to die in fire and take someone with them. At first, these tales were brushed aside, explained as coincidence or the madness of battle. But soon, too many reports piled up to ignore. Something was shifting in the Japanese soul of the war. The Americans celebrated their victories, yes, but unease crept in. It was one thing to fight an enemy who believed he could win. It was another to face one who no longer cared if he lived. And so, as the campaign in the Solomons drew to a close, the Americans found themselves standing on the edge of a new and terrifying question. They had broken the Zero, shattered its myth, bled its pilots dry. But had they truly broken the Japanese spirit, or had they unleashed something far more dangerous, something that would haunt the skies in ways no one could yet imagine? The answer lay ahead in the Philippines and the Marianas, where new battles would erupt and a new horror would reveal itself. For soon, the Zero would not just be a fighter. It would become a weapon of despair, and in that moment, the Americans would realize the nightmare was not ending. It was only changing shape. The ocean stretched endless and blue, but beneath its calm surface, the Pacific War had entered a new and terrible phase. The Solomons were behind them, but the Americans were no longer fighting simply to survive. They were advancing, island by island, clawing their way toward Japan itself. And everywhere, the Zeros rose to meet them, desperate shadows of the invincible machines they had once been. By 1944, the Americans had unleashed a weapon the Japanese had no answer for: the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. Big, tough, and merciless, it was the machine the Zero had never been designed to face. In speed, in climb, in firepower, the Hellcat outclassed its rival. Where the Zero danced lightly, the Hellcat struck with crushing weight. And the men flying them were no longer rookies, groping for tactics in terror. They were veterans, hardened by Coral Sea, by Midway, by Guadalcanal. They had learned in blood how to fight. And now they carried that knowledge with machines that could finally match their courage. The first great test came in the Marianas. The islands were stepping stones straight toward the Japanese homeland, and the Empire could not afford to lose them. When the Americans launched their assault in June 1944, the Japanese gathered every plane they could, muster more than 400 fighters. Many of them still Zeros, flown by pilots who had grown up believing their machine could never be beaten. They took off with pride, convinced they would drive the Americans into the sea. What followed would be remembered in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. You can picture the scene. The carriers churn the waves, their decks alive with the thunder of aircraft launching into the sky. Hellcats climb in squadrons, forming deadly arcs of steel across the horizon. Then the Zeros come, swarming, their engines shrieking as they dive into the fray. At first, the battle seems evenly matched to legends colliding in the open sky. But the illusion vanishes almost instantly. Hellcats tear into the Japanese formations with devastating efficiency. Their pilots, drilled in the lessons of survival, no longer fall into turning duels. They dive, slash, climb, regroup. Zeros shatter. In fireballs, one after another, their fragile frames unable to withstand the punishment. The Japanese pilots fight with suicidal courage, pressing their attacks even as their comrades fall around them. But courage cannot replace training. By this stage of the war, Japan has lost most of its veterans. Many of the men flying are barely out of school, rushed through flight programs, thrown into battle with only hours of practice. Against them are Americans who have lived through years of war, men who know the Zero's weaknesses as intimately as they know the beat of their own hearts. By the end of the day, more than 250 Japanese aircraft are gone. Entire squadrons have been wiped out. American losses are fewer than 30. The numbers are so staggering that pilots, watching the wreckage fall into the sea, shake their heads in disbelief. They had once feared the Zero as an invincible predator. Now it lies broken in the waves by the hundreds. The myth is dead, and with it, Japan's hope of controlling the skies. But victory does not bring comfort. In the quiet after the battle, American pilots walk the carrier decks and talk in low voices about what they have seen. They had expected fierce resistance, but not this kind of madness. Many Zeros had pressed on even when hopelessly outnumbered, diving straight into enemy formations as though eager to die. Some even ignored fighters entirely, hurling themselves at bombers in reckless head-on attacks. It was not just desperation. It was something darker, and here, the earlier whispers return, no longer dismissed as rumor. Reports spread of Japanese pilots deliberately crashing into targets rather than breaking away. Some officers laugh it off as coincidence. Others feel a chill they cannot shake. For if the Zero, once the hunter, is now flown as a weapon of suicide, what will the war become? The Americans press onward, seizing the Marianas. The loss of these islands cuts Japan's empire in half, severing supply lines, placing Tokyo itself within reach of American bombers. But each victory brings with it a rising unease. For every island conquered, for every squadron of Zeros destroyed, the Japanese do not retreat into despair. They fight harder, more recklessly, as though acknowledging that defeat is inevitable, but still refusing to surrender. In October 1944, the storm breaks. The Americans strike at the Philippines, determined to liberate them and break Japan's last hold on the Pacific. The Japanese throw everything they have into the defense. Once more, the Zero rises from its airfields, but now it carries a different meaning. No longer the proud symbol of invincibility, it has become a vessel for sacrifice. The Battle of Leyte Gulf explodes across sea and sky. Carriers duel with carriers, battleships trade salvos, destroyers charge in suicidal runs. And above it all, Zeros dive and burn. For the first time, American crews witness the full transformation. A Zero, its pilot refusing to pull away, crashes deliberately into the deck of a carrier. The explosion tears through steel, killing dozens. Shock ripples through the fleet. This was no accident. This was intention. The kamikaze had been born. The twist has arrived. The Americans had broken the myth, shattered the Zero's dominance. But in destroying it, they had unleashed a new terror-an enemy that no longer fought to win, but to die. The Zero, once feared for its agility, was now feared for its pilot's willingness to use it as a guided missile. Every incoming dive might not be a strafing run, but a death strike. The skies, once a place of calculated duels, had become a realm of suicide. For the Americans, it was a nightmare. Anti-aircraft gunners fired until their barrels glowed red, desperate to shoot down attackers before they struck. Pilots engaged Zeros not only to survive, but to protect their ships from destruction. Alarm on deck sent men running, hearts pounding, eyes searching the horizon for the telltale glint of wings, diving too directly, too unwaveringly, to be anything but fatal. And yet, beneath the horror, another truth emerged. Kamikaze tactics were not signs of strength. They were signs of collapse. Japan no longer had the veteran pilots, no longer had the industrial power to match America's endless stream of Hellcats, Corsairs, and Mustangs. The Zero was being used not because it could win, but because it was all that remained. Still, for the men on the receiving end, this truth offered little comfort. They lived each day under the shadow of flaming wreckage, each night haunted by the memory of comrades consumed in fire. And so the Americans pressed forward, step by bloody step, toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the skies would turn into storm clouds of fire, and where the full fury of the kamikaze would be unleashed. There, in those final battles, the Zero would take its last shape not as an invincible fighter, not even as a fading legend, but as the embodiment of desperation. And the men who faced it would realize that the end of the war, though certain, might come at a price so terrible it would scar them for life. The Zero was dying, but as it died, it promised to drag thousands with it. And in that looming darkness, one question pulsed, sharper than any before. If an enemy will sacrifice everything, absolutely everything, how much must you be willing to give to stop him? The sea wind at Iwo Jima carried the stench of sulfur and death. Black volcanic sands swallowed men and machines alike, while Mount Suribachi loomed like a jagged tooth against the horizon. This was not just another battlefield, it was a stepping stone to Japan itself. And the Japanese knew it. That knowledge poured into every trench, every tunnel, and every cockpit of every Zero still able to fly. From the beginning, the assault was a storm. American Marines clawed their way across beaches under a rain of fire. But overhead, the skies told a different, darker story. The Zeros that once struck fear into Allied pilots now came screaming down not to duel, not to evade, but to die. Kamikaze strikes turned the ocean into a graveyard of twisted steel. Carriers burned, destroyers staggered, decks were shredded open like paper. The men who faced these attacks spoke of the chilling moment when they realized a diving plane wasn't pulling away. Its course was too steady, its commitment too absolute. It was a weapon guided by human will. And that made it more terrifying than anything they had yet seen. Yet even in this nightmare, there were echoes of the old legend. Some kamikaze pilots were once aces, men who had danced the skies with brilliance, who had mastered the Zero's every curve and climb. Now they strapped on headbands, took farewell cups of sake, and launched into one-way flights. For them, the Zero was no longer an instrument of victory, but of sacrifice. For the Americans who faced them, it was a haunting reversal. The very machine they had learned to beat, had learned to strip of myth, was now more dangerous precisely because it no longer fought to live. The Americans adapted, as they always had. At Iwo Jima, radar screens glowed endlessly, spotting the incoming raids. Hellcats scrambled from carriers, intercepting the Zeros before they reached the fleet. Anti-aircraft guns choked the skies with steel, creating walls of fire that made every kamikaze run into a gauntlet of death. Some attackers were torn apart miles before reaching their targets, but others broke through. A single Zero diving at full speed could undo months of shipyard work, could kill hundreds in an instant, and every sailor on deck knew that one slip, one moment too late, might mean fiery death. The climax came not in the air alone, but on the ground. The capture of Iwo Jima gave the Americans what they had fought so desperately for: airfields close enough to launch bombers directly against the Japanese home islands. It was a turning point so profound that even as the Zeros hurled themselves against the fleet, commanders in Tokyo understood the implications. The war had moved to Japan's doorstep. The Empire's skies, once owned by the Zero, now belonged to the enemy. But the nightmare did not end there. If Iwo Jima had been a blood-soaked warning, Okinawa became the inferno. In April 1945, as American forces closed in, the Japanese unleashed the largest wave of kamikazes yet. Over 1,500 aircraft, many of them still Zeros, dove in wave after wave at the American fleet. It was a spectacle of fire and madness unlike anything seen before. Ships burned from bow to stern. The USS Bunker Hill lost nearly 400 men in a single strike. Crews fought flames with bare hands, dragged charred bodies from twisted wreckage, and stared into skies that seemed filled with death itself. And yet, beneath this fury lay a tragic truth. These attacks were not victories. For every ship crippled, Japan lost dozens of irreplaceable aircraft and pilots. The empire was bleeding itself dry in an attempt to hold back a tide that could no longer be stopped. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was now the coffin for its youth. Still, the Americans could not shake the fear. Imagine standing on the deck of a carrier at Okinawa, the sun blazing on the water. Suddenly, alarms wail. Men rush to stations, hearts pounding. You look to the horizon and see it tiny specks growing larger, faster. Planes, Zeros, diving straight for you. The sky erupts in flak, gunners firing with every ounce of desperation. Some attackers vanish in flames, but one just once slips through. Its engine roars, its wings flash, and in those final seconds, you understand that nothing will stop it. Then fire consumes the deck, and the world becomes chaos. By Okinawa's end, Japan's air power was shattered. Thousands of planes destroyed, thousands of pilots lost. The Americans had endured a nightmare and emerged victorious. But the victory was hollow in its cost. Nearly 5,000 sailors had died from kamikaze attacks, and many more were scarred forever. The war's final battles had proven a grim paradox by breaking the Zero. The Americans had forced Japan into tactics that made the dying plane more lethal than ever. And so, as the Americans prepared for the final invasion of Japan itself, one question loomed larger than all others. If the Japanese had thrown everything into Okinawa, if they had sent thousands to die willingly, what would they do when the homeland was at stake? Would the skies fill with tens of thousands of suicide planes, crashing endlessly into the fleet until invasion was impossible? Could even America's factories, even its carriers and Hellcats and bombers, withstand such madness? The men who fought at Okinawa did not know the answer. All they knew was that victory was close, and yet so far away. That every mile gained brought them deeper into a war where the rules had collapsed, where an enemy no longer sought survival but only destruction. The Zero had begun the war as a phantom of invincibility. It ended as a ghost of desperation, a machine twisted into the image of its nation's crumbling spirit. But it was not finished yet. The Americans feared that the next great battle, the invasion of Japan itself, would drown the season fire unlike anything they had endured before. And then, in August 1945, something unimaginable changed everything. The world would end the Zero story not in the skies, but in a blinding flash of light.